On this episode of The Ethics Experts, we talk with Bob Chaput about his latest book about cyber risk management, how the CISO role has changed over time, and how if you want to be a CISO and a real expert in cyber security management, you need to be adding value to the business, and you need to be having a broader conversation about business value and impact, not just risk management. If you want to get to that seat at the table, you want to be in that board discussion, you have to understand how to contribute to those things, and you have to understand how the things that you're doing are not just about risk management, they're about driving the business forward on a bunch of different fronts beyond just the defense. So join us on this episode. Hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Ethics Experts. I'm Gio Gallo, and I'm excited to have a conversation today about cybersecurity, risk stance, and I'm excited to welcome Bob Chaput to discuss his latest book and some other things around cybersecurity. So welcome to the Ethics Experts. And if you're a subscriber, then I love the way you do your work and how you help everyone around you with such an open heart. And that's what you're going to get. If you're a subscriber to the Ethics Experts, then every episode you get an extra and a special welcome to the show. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you to Bob. Bob's latest book is really doing great. People are really excited about it, and I'm excited to talk about it. It's called Enterprise Cyber Risk Management as a Value Creator, and it challenges CISOs, boards, and C-suites to focus equally on cyber opportunities as well as cyber risks to create business value, drive growth, and competitive advantage. He is also the author of his prior book, which you should check out, called Stop the Cyberbleeding. He's a go-to resource for healthcare leaders and directors and CISOs outside of healthcare. He is the founder and executive chairman of Clearwater Compliance and remains a trusted advisor and confidant to executives and board members seeking cybersecurity and cyber risk expertise to protect their enterprise from internal and external threats. Bob, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be able to spend some time with you, Gio. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. So we cover a wide range of things around culture and ethics and risk management throughout the Ethics Experts, and obviously cybersecurity and the things that we all need to do to protect the companies and the people we work with only is becoming more and more important. So, I'd love to start by talking about your latest book, Cyber Risk Management as a Value Creator. I really love that approach because I think more and more CEOs and boards and people around companies are understanding that cybersecurity is not just something to protect the business and try to avoid bad things. It really can be part of driving value and helping the company compete. So I'd love to just kind of start by talking about how you got into this book, like why this topic and approach, why now, and maybe tell me a little bit about how it's been received.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the chance to talk about the book. Well, at the beginning, I guess I'll say, as always, considering myself in the fourth quarter of my career, it's another opportunity to give something back. And as you know from your work, the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISOs, have been invited to the big kids table, finally. And along with that invitation comes a new set of requirements for CISOs. And I feel as though, humbly, I'll say I've got the skills and knowledge and experience to be able to help out. This major change in the role of the CISO shifts, as you indicated a moment ago, from being the defender, so to speak, to being more of a boardroom participant, if not a boardroom luminary, you might say. And it's about pivoting from playing defense only to playing offense and thinking more about how cybersecurity can be leveraged to create business value and even competitive advantage. And the other interesting thing that got me to the book is an awakening, literally one night, a recollection of something, now I'm dating myself, that started decades ago in the mid-1980s. The famous Harvard marketing guru, Michael Porter, wrote a paper entitled Information Can Be Used for Competitive Advantage. That kicked off over the ensuing decades major changes in which well-intentioned, honest, hardworking managers of EDP, as we used to call it, directors of information technology, directors of systems, et cetera, were invited to the table. And the role changed from one of being a tactical, technical individual to a requirement to be much more strategic and business oriented. And we're seeing that. We saw that. I experienced that personally, and I'm seeing the very same thing happening to the role of the CISO. So I thought this was really a good opportunity to help CISOs to begin to think about moving away from this defense-only posture and approach to one that was more about business value and business and competitive advantage.
Cool. Yeah, it's been interesting and exciting to see the way that CISOs have been brought to that big kids table. And, obviously there's a lot of support for that, but it's pretty cool that you're tying that back to Porter. And I think that, obviously he got a lot of things right, but that's pretty prescient to see that, information can be used for competitive advantage. And, back when I was going to school, we learned about the 5 forces, and I'm just thinking about that model against the CISO, right? So obviously CISO has been looking at threats before, right? That's one of the 5 forces, but it also can facilitate opportunities. It's relevant to your suppliers, it's relevant to your buyers, and the way that you compete with other people in the market. And it's cool to see, obviously information and IT and the internet is touching more and more areas of the business, and AI is making us reconsider some of those things. But it's cool to see how it's becoming formalized and, more strategic, the way that, hey, how can a CISO help us not just kind of keep threats at bay, but help us compete and be a value driver?
Yeah, and the launch, you asked, how it was going, and so far it's going pretty well. For the initial number of weeks, we actually first published the book at the end of January. For about 3 or 4 weeks, we were ranked as #1 in this wildly crazy category on Amazon called risk management, which ranges from personal risk to financial risk to capital risk to a little bit of cybersecurity.
Sure.
And so we had that, and I took a look last week. We actually were still at #9 at that point in time. So and you touched on it. I think one of the things that's making a difference here is, yes, in terms of the 5 forces, talking about threats, and if I may just tweak that a little bit and talk about risk.
Yeah.
This is about not only thinking about your cyber risk, but also thinking about your cyber opportunities. And also in the vein of how the book is going, I've had several universities contact me, and they're considering using the book as a text in their cyber risk management program. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Congratulations to you on having such a great impact. #1 in the category, top 10 for going on 4 months. That's an amazing accomplishment. And I think it speaks to not just how good the book is, but the wealth of knowledge that you have from the career that you've spent leading and driving value for businesses through security and the things that touch that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that's pretty cool to think about the students and the next generation of leaders coming into information and CISO being taught this broader viewpoint because, that's, in a lot of ways it's more complex and more exciting, but, I think we all want to have an impact on our career. We want to help people and, make things better for the world. And it's pretty cool to think about students learning that discipline and thinking about this broader scope of not just, defending and risk, but, those value drivers. If I can draw, maybe a extreme example or a generalization, the board at times, unless there's a flashing red light or red flag and fire about risk, they get much more engaged, and the CEO wants to talk about opportunities and where can we go and how can we build the whole organization. What do you think are some things that have driven that transformation to bring the CISO to that big kids table? Because I think a lot of our listeners are across the the GRC and the risk management space in people and ethics and things like that. And a lot of people have a similar view of, hey, we're not just doing this one thing, right? We're not just dealing with one of Porter's five forces. We can impact the culture and the organization and our opportunities. What are some things that have driven that shift? Obviously, just like technology is more important, but it seems to have kind of crested past the kind of the fuller adoption on the curve. What are some things that you think are driving that now?
Yeah, well, I'll come back to, first of all, I think most people would agree that the top three things that the board of directors worries about or is responsible for include hiring and firing the CEO, right? Leadership.
Sure.
Some people, well, let's put that more gently in the category of talent management.
Yeah, that's nice.
Strategy, and then finally risk management around the execution of that strategy. And so historically, the one and only way that CISOs have been able to, for lack of a better word, hook the board or connect to the board is through that avenue of risk management. And no two ways about it.
Sure.
It's not like that's going away. That's still very, very important. And we don't just drop defense and play only offense. That's not going to happen. But if we think about what most boards under that category of strategy, what are most boards trying to do? Increase market share, grow the business, maintain their reputation, build more customer loyalty and trust. In that category, there are several ways in which the value can be created. Some of them include, I just touched on, increasing customer trust and brand loyalty.
Yeah.
A great example of that. Unless someone was on an interplanetary space mission for the last 10 years, they probably heard about the big breach that occurred at Equifax back in 2017. And for lack of a better way of saying it, all hell broke loose. The CEO is gone, the CIO is gone. It was a huge mess. There were derivative lawsuits. If you now look at what Equifax is doing in this area, they proactively publish a security annual report. And that's all about customer trust and brand loyalty.
Right.
That's an example of using cybersecurity to create a business value. Another example, think about the cost of capital. This is of great interest to the CFO as an example. All businesses need capital to grow. All three major credit rating agencies today include the cybersecurity risk posture of an organization in their ultimate determination of what the credit rating was. Guess what happened at Equifax? Their credit rating got knocked down several notches as a result of their event. So I've worked with organizations that focused on lowering the cost of capital by way of their proactive cybersecurity program. And related to that, another item of interest is lowering the cost of the premiums related to the executive risk insurance program.
Yep.
Another way of doing it. I worked with a private equity firm. These are value creation opportunities. And fundamentally, by way of the strength of their cybersecurity program, they attracted higher quality investments than they otherwise would have in their efforts to sell one of their portfolio companies. And then last but not least, Clearwater works with a lot of organizations that are in, I'll put it generally, the health IT space. And they're going to the large players, the large providers, the health plans, the large health systems, integrated delivery networks, and they're presenting their value proposition. Well, they can't even open the door until or unless they can talk about the fact that they're going to secure, as a business associate in healthcare language and HIPAA language, they're not going to open the door until or unless they can put forth that they've got a decent cybersecurity and compliance program. And what the wise ones are doing is really making an investment so that they can go out and include that in their marketing materials and really wave the flag. That's another value creation opportunity.
That's great. There's really so much there, and it's so rich. And the modern day CISO needs to understand not just how to build the program and what things we need in place for monitoring and defense and things like that, but if you're anywhere in GRC or risk or ethics, you need to understand the broader scope of the impact of the things that you do, because that's going to affect the budget that you get, the vision that you set for your team, and you have to understand that, there's a certain scope of the actions that you take, and then there's a much broader scope of the impact of those actions. And, that the Equifax issue that you brought up, it became a reputational issue. This was not just what is the cost of securing the breach. That trickled over into reputation and engagement of, consumers and buyers and things like that. And good on them for learning from that, right? Like, it's always great to learn from your mistakes. We talk here at Ethico about, we don't win or lose, we win or learn. And if we make a mistake, that can be tuition to learn and make it better for yourself and share that with your team. So good on them for learning that. But my dad always said, you need to think about what's a better instructor in life, experience or knowledge, and learning from someone else's experience. And the lesson was, if you can learn from someone else making that mistake, then you don't have to go through the pain of that loss, and then you can do a good job and avoid that pain. And you've done a great job in your book, Bob, showing people how they can learn from your experience, from your decades in this industry, and the experience of other people. And as leaders, we have to be leading our team and our CEO and our board to say, hey, you know what? Let's make sure we don't make that mistake, and let's build, defense for the reputation or whatever it might be. And understanding that impact is part of how we can be that leader that's invited to that strategic conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that reputation piece is interesting, because I imagine 20 years ago, that was not part of the CIO CISO conversation. People weren't really drawing that connection, but certainly, in Equifax and a bunch of other areas, as a population, the average consumer is becoming more and more interested in privacy, and they know about data breaches, and they know, that the impact that it would have with them. And there are a bunch of ways, across different roles that we play in ethics and risk management, where we can impact that decision that's becoming more and more important, where consumers are willing to move to a different provider or choose to buy from somebody, or even pay more for someone who they trust, for someone who has a good reputation. And that CISO is, becoming more and more core to the bouquet of different contributors to a good reputation.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. And what I see is, and you touched upon this, as was the case with the IT organization and the CIO, it was always a matter of running the cost center.
Yeah.
And it wasn't viewed. It was about uptime. The CIO's responsibility is keep the systems up, automate things so that we gather some efficiency in the operations that we're doing. CIOs today are being called upon to generate revenue. What are new refreshing ideas that you can come up with to help us generate revenue? Similar kind of thing is happening as we encounter what the CISO is looking at on his or her agenda. And that is this whole notion of, it's not just about managing the downside.
Yeah.
It's about managing those opportunities. The difference between risk and opportunity. If you're all about and only about managing risk, then you're going to be a cost center forever and ever and ever. If, on the other hand, you're about leveraging opportunities that you have, strengths that you have in your cyber program, you're going to begin to be viewed as an investment area.
Yeah.
Investment center, not necessarily a cost center. That's a mind-bending idea for the typical CISO who shows up every day, tactical, technical, playing the game of whack-a-mole, which is essentially a lot of what goes on today, when they're going to be required. If they're not today, the mind-bending idea, embrace what I'm saying, I say humbly, because it is changing. You're going to have to move from tactical to strategic. You're going to have to move from technical to being more business-oriented. You're going to have to move out of that whack-a-mole, firefighting, spot welding mode into being much more architectural about how you go about doing your business. And this matter of managing the upside versus the downside, I wish I could take credit for those phrases, which I use in the book. It actually comes out of the National Association of Corporate Directors, and I'll mention them again. in a moment. I went through a number of their educational programs. This is where the board people go and live and hang out and drink Kool-Aid together. In an educational program, they talked about risk in a very enlightened way, which was it's not just about the bad things that can happen. And if you look at various definitions of risk, one of which comes out of the so-called Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, COSO, they talk about risk as being defined as the possibility of events occurring that may affect the execution of your business strategy.
Right.
They don't say bad events. They say events occurring. And the events could be positive events from the point of view of business. Similarly, in the world of cybersecurity, there are lots of positives that are going unappreciated and unleveraged as a result of the point of view that it's defense, defense, defense. So in the context of the cyber risk management, I'm trying to encourage organizations to pivot in their thinking. And yes, absolutely. We all, in all industry segments, have a lot of work to do on the defense side.
Sure.
But on the other hand, it's where it's going is to be, if you're going to sit at the table, now that you've been invited to the big kids table, if you're going to sit at the table, you've got to be a business person, a relationship builder. You've got to talk about growth, revenue generation, competitive advantage, and those things that have not historically been part of the vernacular.
Yeah, it's so important, and it's I love how you say that it's mind-bending because it is a change in your perspective, right? It's not just adding a footnote to the presentation or something like that. We've kind of talked through some layers of this of, how does the board perceive it? You need to impact their perception because if you want to be a leader is about communication and influence. You have to impact the board's perception. That needs to happen with you having a different mindset, right? Because it's probably rare that your board and your CEO are going to be teaching you how to think strategically about this. You need to come to the table bringing that strategic viewpoint. And to do that, you have to have, the programs and the tactics to do that. And I just love how in this book, you're talking about, using this as a value driver because it is a different approach. And I'd love for you to talk, maybe we can get a little bit deeper into it, talk about an example or two of how it might be a change of viewpoint of how you describe this thing you've been doing, or you might be doing it differently or doing something new. What are some of the things that, a CISO today, instead of a decade ago, should be doing or doing differently to be that value driver? Because obviously you need to describe it differently and say, hey, this can help us execute a merger or move into a market or something like that. But I imagine it's also changing some of the, fundamental building blocks of what you put in your program.
Yeah, and you sort of touched on it a moment ago. I would put it this way: it's table stakes to first connect, build trust, build confidence, exude your strengths in the area of risk management. Mm-hmm. So let me back up for a minute. I talked about the talent management part, the strategic part, and I'm talking about risk management. And historically, the one and only way that CISOs have connected with the board was on the risk side of things. Well, that's actually been quite wobbly for most CISOs because there's a fair amount of, and I regard it as one of the two top root causes for the mess that most industries, most organizations are in today with their cybersecurity program. And I'm going to call it risk illiteracy. And we could probably talk about that for a couple of hours, but I'll put it this way. Fundamentally, people do not realize what the ingredients are for risk, an asset, a threat, and a vulnerability, and how to go about evaluating what that risk is by assessing the likelihood and the impact. The first thing that CISOs need to do is learn that themselves, learn the calculus of risk themselves, and then secondarily, help their board understand what that is. Once they pay those table stakes around risk and managing risk, then it's time to open the conversation about what are my cyber opportunities and leveraging my cyber opportunities.
Great.
So in order to do that, the CISO is now, and I touched upon this before, having been tactical and technical and focused on the issues of the day, the threat du jour, the vulnerability du jour, et cetera, has to begin to be much more strategic in their approach, much more business oriented, much more architectural about the approach. That is going to take a new skill set as compared to what we've had before. And as I think about the kinds of qualifications, the kinds of things that CISOs ought to be doing, I'll say it this way. Start studying for the final exam now.
Okay.
And when I say final exam, I'll refer to a couple of bad references. One is, we used to joke that CIO meant career is over. CISO could mean career is seriously over, because one of the things we're seeing in the industry right now is a lot of CISOs are being pointed at as the scapegoat when bad events have happened. It happened in the case of SolarWinds. It happened in the case of, we had a whistleblower thing at Twitter, but it happened in the case of Uber. But anyway, as what CISOs need to begin to do is prepare for the final exam. What do I mean by that? Join organizations like the one I mentioned, National Association of Corporate Directors. Start drinking the same Kool-Aid that directors are drinking. There's a great organization called the Digital Directors Network. And if you want some really good, solid education around how you interact with the board, how you present to the board, et cetera, that's a great place to go. Another thing I would encourage, don't go after that second technical degree, master's in computer science. Go for the MBA. We're looking for business people. What the board is going to be looking for are business people. One of the things that I talked about, this decades-long transformation that occurred starting in the mid-'80s as the CIO role emerged, the boards began to look for people with the business background, people who were relationship builders. If they had the wherewithal to become knowledgeable and educated about technology, that was great, but that wasn't the core requirement. The core requirement was to be more business oriented. And so I would say, in addition, so go after the MBA. And then last but not least, get out into the business. Start building business relationships. Meet with the business leaders, meet with the P&L owners, start understanding how your organization runs. You're going to build relationships, you're going to build credibility. Those are the kinds of things that CISOs need to be doing going forward.
That's great. I love that concept of you got to start studying for the final exam, because, I think a lot of people, if you want to be invited to that big kids table, you want to be invited to that strategic conversation, we can't wait for someone to say, hey, I should start teaching you things so that 3 years from now you can come into this strategic conversation. We got to start teaching ourselves. So get the book, because that's a great way to start studying for the exam. But also we need to be able to envision where we need to go and start learning how to be there, because the chances are that we're going to have to start that conversation and maybe put it as a slide in your next board meeting of and also we're going to start talking about these things and start making that part of the conversation yourself. Because I think it's a pretty tough gambit if you're kind of sitting in your box at the kiddie table, at the tactical, staying on risks and threats, hoping that someone says, hey, can you please start helping us talk about these things? That's what people at the board level do. They open the conversation, they drive the understanding of other people. And in order to drive that conversation, you need to kind of know what you're talking about. And it takes a broader viewpoint, to your point, talking to other people in the business, learning some things, maybe getting an MBA. You have to have that broader viewpoint to drive that conversation, because you're probably going to have to start seeding that conversation before you're invited into, the next or the fifth conversation about it.
Yeah, I may be wrong, and I reserve the right always to be wrong. But what I spent a number of years, a combination of probably 22 years at GE and Johnson & Johnson, and it was during this era. And over the course of a couple of decades, we replaced probably 26 or 27 IT leaders, if you will, IT managers with vice presidents and senior vice presidents and executive vice presidents. I did the same thing when I was a member of the staff at Johnson & Johnson, the corporate office of information technology. I reported to the CISO. Over time, with over 80 operating companies in Johnson & Johnson, those CIOs, those IT leaders were replaced with well-educated, business-oriented CIOs. I really believe the same thing is going to happen in the cybersecurity space as well, and with the CISO role.
Yeah, and to get back to the five forces, that dynamic of replacing leaders, of we need to upgrade and upskill, that can be either a threat for you if you're kind of staying in the old lane, or it can be an opportunity for you to say, hey, you know what, I've built these skills. Whenever you're ready to have the conversation, I got some ideas for a plan and things like that. But it's great that you're illuminating this, Bob, because there's a change in the landscape, right? This is why you wrote the book. This is, we're seeing this across boards and organizations. The landscape is changing. The mix of skills that you need, that mix is changing. And you can be ready for that, or you can be caught off guard by it. And a great way to, start studying for that exam and being ready for it is to start upskilling. And you need to be learning things beyond what the current demands on your job are. I get that's hard. If you're not busy, you're not doing it right? But like, we all have a lot to do, but you got to make time to invest in yourself, because some companies, depending on how fast they're growing or how quickly things are changing, maybe there's time for you to grow into it and wait until your boss tells you, hey, you should probably go join this and do this. But again, that's kind of a tough gambit. You should be doing that yourself so that you're ready when they call on you.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I'd love to see if you have any other tips. You talked about getting into the business and understanding things outside of the cyber team. Other than just kind of having conversations and understanding what's going on there, how can a CISO or someone on this track start providing value to some of these other teams in hiring an HR, compliance and ethics, rank and file managers, or things like that? What are some steps they can take to really build that within the network in their company, and again, kind of be useful before someone's asking them to do a project?
Yeah, it's something I wrote about in the current book, and it's something that I wrote about in my previous book as well. And it's the old phrase: this is a team sport. This is not about an individual, whether it's a chief risk officer or whether it's a chief compliance officer or a chief information security officer. This is not about one individual. In fact, that kind of thinking leads to a very siloed, very broken approach to the very common ground across cybersecurity, compliance, ethics, et cetera. And so first and foremost, make sure you think about this as a team sport.
Yeah.
In that regard, think about a governance, and I define governance in a rather homey, broken down, easy way. It's about who makes what decisions, how and when, using what data and facts. And a very common governance structure that I've used myself and that I've recommended is there's a working group at a certain level. And this obviously scales and adapts and adjusts to the size of the organization. And so what I'm describing may exist in one company, or it may exist in operating units within a business. So there's a cross-functional working group of people. There's the executive team that serves as the next level above that. And then there's the board of directors, or oftentimes commonly a committee on the board of directors that worries about cybersecurity. So first and foremost is use that theme of it being a team sport in building out your governance structure. And secondarily, this matter of starting with the board and this whole idea of risk illiteracy, it's not that, I don't mean to be insulting or disrespectful in any way. It's not that boards don't understand risk. They do. They may not understand it in the way that cyber risk, and I should say cyber opportunity, should be understood. So I would really focus a lot. You talked about a board agenda item. One of the board agenda items I've recommended forever is that there always be an educational module in the board agenda item. And that can start with some of the basic terminology around risk.
Great.
There's a very tight relationship between cybersecurity and compliance, obviously.
Yeah.
And so part of the team sport theory is you're head of ethics and compliance, you're head of compliance, you're head of risk, and the CISO and others can get together on this subject matter, especially as it relates to compliance. I think about the explosion of regulations that we're seeing. Here in the US, we've taken a very sectoral approach to compliance and regulations and around cybersecurity and privacy. as opposed to what you see in the European model with GDPR as an example.
Right.
Here we've got HIPAA, we've got FERPA, we've got, financial regulations, et cetera. I think it was Winston Churchill who said, if you end up with 10,000 regulations, you'll end up with no respect for the law. Well, it's a little off topic, and we're not going to beat back all the regulators. But if you want to be effective at your compliance and risk management program, it's a further argument for this being a team sport.
Yeah.
I talked about the CFO and their involvement, and this is, again, all in the spirit of reaching out. This is not a CISO problem or solely a CISO responsibility. Right. And of course, this could be a whole separate discussion. The whole notion of ethics and social responsibility and organizations standing up their ESG programs are not unaffected by what is happening in the privacy, security, and cyber risk management areas as well.
Right.
So there are lots and lots of ways for this to transcend the entire organization and engage lots of others, not just the technology team and not just the CISO's team.
Yeah, that's great. I love that perspective that this is a team sport. And, I think that if you're not, obviously if you're the CISO, then you kind of know who your team is, right? It's the chief HR officer, it's the chief revenue officer, it's the CFO. But if you're kind of in the middle of the org chart, well, then you can mock that board makeup and say, hey, do I know someone who's also a VP in HR or also a manager in HR? Do I know someone in the sales team or in marketing that's kind of at my level? And you can start building that facility with, well, what matters to them? How can I collaborate with them? How can I help them so that when I want to get them to adopt a process or help me figure this out, do that? Because if, to the team sport thing, if you want to have full company impact, if you want to be full company strategy, in those conversations, then you have to have full company kind of understanding and, relationships and things like that. And you can start building that before, again, you're invited to the table and someone says, hey, you need to sit down with the chief revenue officer and help figure this out.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of something I used to do when I was doing more talks in front of groups of people. I'd go into the room and I'd say, please raise your hand if you're responsible for cybersecurity in your organization. And maybe 1, 2, or 3, or 10 hands would go up, the CISOs in the room. No.
Exactly.
Everyone is responsible for it.
Yeah.
You're all deputized. You're now a deputized privacy officer, security officer, compliance officer. It absolutely is a team sport. And everybody in the organization needs to think about it that way.
Yeah. If you're around assets and you could be a node of risk for a vulnerability, then you need to be part of the solution for cyber and information security.
Too often, as we look at the root causes of various events, attacks, and breaches that are happening, it gets down to the human element.
Yeah.
And somebody who's been susceptible to a phishing attack or a vishing attack or something like that. And at a very individual operational level, what everybody in the organization needs to think about is that all of this is getting much, much more sophisticated.
Yep.
We're not going to have a deep conversation about artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence engines are now writing these phishing emails and generating these phishing phone calls and spear phishing efforts that are underway. And so from an operational point of view, everybody in the organization needs to be alert and aware that this stuff is just dialing up and getting more and more sophisticated. At a strategic level, and this applies, and not everybody gets to think strategically every day in their organization, but they need to think that this is an existential risk to their organization. Business organizations are going out of business as a result of this. Larger ones can obviously tolerate some of these expenses. The big Anthem breach that occurred, a number of years ago, was estimated to have cost Anthem maybe $500 million. Wow. What's happening today, and this is another healthcare example, the Change Healthcare attack that has totally disrupted healthcare. There are estimates now that this could be a $1.6 billion cost
Wow.
to United at the end of the day.
Sure.
And not everybody has a $500 million or $1.6 billion to be able to absorb something like this.
Yeah.
So it's truly at a strategic level, and individuals should think this way as well. This could be the end of my career, the end of my current career and current job, if we're not all collectively more attentive to this issue.
Yeah, and you got to get ahead of it if you don't want your CISO title to mean career is seriously over.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's it's such a good point because, I don't know, at some point there were massively fewer nodes of risk and vulnerabilities through information security, right? It was just your server farm or something, and now, even if you have a bunch of field personnel, they all got a tablet or a phone that they're using, and, at the end of the day, there's a lot that a CISO can do to harden your infrastructure and monitor things and blacklist websites, but there's still so much of the human element that not only is a point of vulnerability, but also can be a point of strength if you're building that fuller conversation. So around that, what's something that you would like or you would advise people to get into the minds of their kind of rank and file frontline production workers to help them think differently about this? Obviously there's a conversation up or, lateral to the board and things like that. But how might someone help their employees think about this differently now than they did 15, 20 years ago?
Yeah, a couple of things. Well, first, a couple of things that I just mentioned about strategically thinking about it as existential risk and operationally being alert to the fact that this is only dialing up. Beyond that, I'm going to kick it back up to the board. It's about setting the tone at the top.
Yeah.
And I mentioned one of them. I will, again, without attempting and no disrespect intended to organizations that are doing good work in this area, but generally, this is very messy in all industries. And I know you and I have an affinity to healthcare, and beyond healthcare. But at the top, the board can begin in setting that tone by doing several things. One of which is adopting a set of principles and communicating those principles. That is, we are going to take a principle-based approach to how we're going to do cyber risk management. One principle, for example, is this is not an IT problem. This is a business risk management problem. Another principle in the spirit of the book that I've written is this is not just about playing defense. This is also about leveraging the strengths that we have in the organization. Another principle the board can set is we have an expectation of management to resource this whole area appropriately.
Right.
So I'm going to say, in response to that question, if the board sets the right tone at the top, that's going to begin the process of being part of the mindset of everybody in the organization.
That's great. I love that principled approach. And, that needs to be flowing through all the layers of the organization, tone at the top, mood at the middle, for everyone to know that when you hear from the CISO or when the review of our quarterly, phishing probing comes around, or a reminder to look out for those things, that's in your interest, sales, that's in your interest, HR, that's in your interest, safety and manufacturing and all of that, because this is something that we're all a part of.
Exactly. I think about what I just spoke about. Setting up principles is really about overall governance, how you're going to manage it. I regard the single most important question or decision for the board to facilitate is not about what are we going to do with multi-factor authentication or what are we going to be doing with encryption and device management. It gets to this macro or strategic level matter of how are we going to go about doing cyber risk management? And that kicks off a whole series of important work around governance, people, process, technology, and engagement. And you referred to, whether you're head of manufacturing, you're head of finance, whatever part of the organization you play in, The other way for the board to set the tone at the top is to begin to build privacy, security, cyber risk management, performance objectives into the management performance process.
Cool.
And some progressive organizations are doing that. There's an organization, it happens to be a healthcare organization in Australia, that just made a decision. There goes that thumbs up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Love that idea.
Right. That just withheld $3.6 million in management executive bonuses as a result of a breach that they experienced. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to begin to have the board set in place and oversee. I don't expect the board to become cybersecurity experts.
Sure.
I expect the board to become cybersecurity enablers. And if they do those kinds of things, that's going to set the right tone at the top for everybody in the organization.
That's great. And that's part of the mindset that you're talking about, that if you're a CISO, you need to lead the board into that conversation, not have a debate about some form of MFA or something, but to say, I love that. The board should be cybersecurity enablers, set the tone, and then let the rest of the organization figure out how to meet those objectives. So as we get close to wrapping up here, Bob, after this, I'd love to hear if there's anything else that we've missed or you'd like to wrap up with. But what advice would you give to an aspiring CISO, maybe early in the or middle of their career, and how might that advice be different from what it would take to get to the top spot, maybe 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think it ties back to some of the things that we've already touched upon. One of which is really begin to, you're at this fork in the road right now. I would take the business route rather than I would the technology route.
Big.
I would focus more on the MBA, and there might be some concentration in privacy, security, and risk management. I think about that. As I mentioned earlier, I would really begin to, and this has I'll call it happy hour, 2 potential good benefits. Look into the National Association of Corporate Directors.
Great.
It is a very valuable experience to begin to drink the board Kool-Aid now, but there are regulations recently passed by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And while this sounds like it's only applicable to publicly traded companies, I think it's going to be more pervasive around cybersecurity disclosures. One of the items that was proposed and did not make it into the final rule was that an organization be required to disclose whether or not they have cybersecurity expertise on their board or not.
Wow.
It did not pass. There was an expectation that had it passed, a lot of CISOs would begin to be invited not only to the table within their organization, but to take on board roles. I believe that's going to evolve and happen over time. So the 2-for-1 happy hour effect that I talked about was, if you start drinking the NACD Kool-Aid now as a second career or later in life career for many of these CISOs, I think it's going to be a wealth of opportunity. And you're not going to get that board seat by being a one-trick pony because you happen to know something about cybersecurity. You're going to have to be a business person first and foremost. So top of mind, those are some of the things that I would advise. Whereas 10 years ago, it was probably, get that second degree in cybersecurity and take more, earn more technology credentials and security credentials. I think it's really pivoting towards a business bias right now.
Yeah, that's such great advice. And so, I would add to that if you're interested in advancing your career and getting to the CISO office, rewind this episode and listen to all the great advice from Bob that we've gone over here. And while you're listening, go out and get the latest book, Enterprise Cyber Risk Management as a Value Creator by Bob Chaput. It's been great having you on the show today, Bob. Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks for all the things that you're doing to not only help CISOs advance their career and be more strategic, but the work that you're doing to help educate the current and up-and-coming leaders is really helping companies and boards better prepare, not just for risk mitigation, but for driving that value and achieving their missions and driving their strategy forward. So thanks for joining us today on the Ethics Experts, Bob, and thanks for everything that you're doing.
Thank you, Gallo. As always, a pleasure being with you.